Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. And Joe, I think we're going to talk about an aquatics episode, and you want to talk about amphibians.
I do. I want to talk about some frogs and salamanders, so fun little critters to see.
Cool. So I guess, first off, what in the world is an amphibian?
Yeah, we know what amphibians are. They're frogs and salamanders, but if you dive into it a little bit deeper, trying to understand what they are, they're ectothermic, and so that means cold-blooded is how most of us probably know that. They're getting their heat from the environment, so they're going to be really active in warmer months. You're going to slow down and when it gets to be colder outside. So they're ectothermic. Most of them undergo metamorphosis, and so frogs, we know when they're little, they're tadpoles, right? And then tadpoles start to grow legs and they become terrestrial. A lot of times they'll switch from being in an aquatic setting to moving into a terrestrial habitat. So they need both of those habitats. We're going to talk about why that's important in a little bit. Another really cool feature is that, they breathe secondarily through their skin. So a lot of frogs and salamanders have lungs. There are some species that don't have developed lungs. They breathe entirely through their skin. But that's important because in order to be able to bring that air or that oxygen exchange to the skin, they need to have really thin skin. And they can bring a lot of other things through that skin, too, that might cause problems for them. So, just some cool characteristics about amphibians.
Sure. So once they're adults, I know a lot of them will spend time out of the water, or maybe a lot of their time out of the water and breathe air. Do they have any adaptations before they metamorphose into adults to allow them to breathe underwater?
They have gills to breathe underwater, and so most of them have, most tadpoles, most, of the larval stages, the juvenile stages allow them to breathe underwater. When they start going through that metamorphosis, you can see things like, gulping of air. So if you've ever been out to, puddles are common. So a pond that drains down really low, you'll see what a lot of people think are little fish popping at the surface. And a lot of times that's, frog tadpoles that are just going up to the surface and kind of gulping air. So they have the ability to do both. A lot of, some species are really, really good at that. So bullfrog tadpoles are really good at breathing air and staying in environments that aren't great. But yeah, most of them, their eggs that are laid in the water, they make really long ribbons a lot of times. And those hatch, they breathe the water, breathe the oxygen in the water, and then switch over to lungs when they grow up.
Are there any species that maintain their gills after they're adults?
Yeah, so two exciting species, Drew, are, there are species called hellbenders and mudpuppies. And hellbenders were documented in the 1950s to be in Kansas. That's since been discredited. So they're found in Southeast. They're really big aquatic species. But the species that we still have would be mudpuppies. And mudpuppies are salamanders that are found in water surfaces year-round. They live their entire lives in kind of that. They grow up to adults, but they keep a lot of those larval stages. One of the really distinguishing characteristics of mudpuppies, one, they're really big. So they get to be 10, 12 inches long. They can be really big for a salamander. But then they have these feathery gills, and so they have external gills, really cool looking. If you haven't seen a mudpuppy, go look it up. I bet you'll get excited.
Yeah, those are cool. I remember one time when I was a kid, was just throwing a net, dragging it through the pond, seeing what I could catch at the house, and I caught a whole bunch of really young mudpuppies.
Really?
One time, yeah, and they were, they were probably 3 inches long or so, but had those big feathery gills like you were talking about. Real quick before we go on, a lot of times we talk about reptiles and amphibians together. So what makes an amphibian different from a reptile?
Yeah, there's a few different things, but one of them is that obligatory aquatic stage. So they have to live in water. They need water to complete their life cycle. That's a really big stage. There's differences in the skin. So amphibians tend to have wet skin. They're breathing through that a lot. Reptiles tend to have a rougher, drier skin. Those are kind of the big characteristics. There's differences in how they breed and a lot of larval characteristics, but those are kind of the big ones. Are they living most of their life on land? Can they complete their life cycle on land, or do they need that aquatic environment to complete their life cycle?
Sure. I can't think of any reptile species that would ever have a stage where they had gills. They don't go through that metamorphosis, do they?
Yeah, they don't do that. They don't have the metamorphosis. Most of them are just growing up. They don't have gills. That's that obligatory aquatic stage I was talking about. So really good point. They're not changing over. They're not metamorphosizing most of the time.
Cool. I know one of the things that I always enjoy is when I first start hearing frogs.
Yeah.
And that kind of, that's a big sign of spring. I hear them a lot of times out in the prairie.
Yeah.
If it's gotten wet, we've got those cricket frogs and other coarse frog species that might be up in an old bison wallow or something like that, but I always enjoy that.
The first calls, that to me is like, all right, spring is here. Most of the winter's behind us. When I was little, I used to think that was crickets, and I'd go out to ponds and I'd search around and couldn't find any of these daggone crickets. And, I realize now that a lot of times that was frogs that just sound like crickets.
Yeah.
And so, but those different sounds that you're hearing, it's fun. And a big way that you identify them, these animals are coming out when it's darker. But if you listen, it all kind of sounds the same if you're not paying attention. But if you start to, dive in a little bit, you can see there are a lot of species out there. So it's really fun to listen to all the different calls that you can have in the spring. So that's really when you start to know that spring is here, because you're starting to hear all these frogs call.
Yeah. So it's fall now. Is there anything significant about the fall time frame if we're thinking about amphibians?
Yeah, they're calling, these animals are calling mostly to attract mates. And so that's dying off now, but they're still calling some out there. And so this is a good time to go out and do surveys and kind of understand, hey, how did the year go for these amphibians? We talked about how they're ectothermic, so they're going to slow down. They're going to go into senescence for the colder time periods. So we're not going to see a lot of activities. So this is a time that a lot of biologists would be going out and kind of doing their management strategies to figure out how are different populations doing. So good time of year to get out. That's a good opportunity too for listeners to understand that, getting a biologist out to a pond or a creek or whatever water body you might have would be a good opportunity to team up and give the biologists some access to areas they might not otherwise see, and then give you some feedback on maybe, hey, if you want to attract more nature or something like that to your habitat, what can you do? So
Sure.
Just a good opportunity to mention, you can team up. If that opportunity is there, it's always great.
Yeah. I know before we get off of talking about their calls, one of the things that I thought about while you were talking about that, when we have a prolonged drought, it stays pretty dry. There's some of these species that if they don't have rainfall or don't have enough dew, then we may not see them around. And tree frogs are one of those species that I think about. I know when we had the last couple of big droughts, after it started raining again and it was warm, that I heard tree frogs once it got wet, and it's like, oh, I haven't heard a tree frog this summer.
Yeah.
That's just kind of one of those things that stands out in my mind.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a really prolonged period. They need a little bit of time to have access to that wet environment. But getting out in an area where a pool of water is collected for a few weeks can be enough to complete that life cycle. So
yeah,
it is really fun to see kind of that connection between rainfall event. You might get frustrated that there's some flooding in your field or something, but nature's pretty happy about that a lot of times.
Sure. So you said that there's exchange between the water and the skin of these species for oxygen. I imagine that could also have some implications for these species about water quality.
Yeah, water quality, these amphibians are really good indicators of the water quality. And so they're kind of the canaries in the coal mine a lot of times for aquatic systems. So if we start to see declines in amphibians, that a lot of times can indicate, hey, maybe there's a water quality concern we need to think about. And so it's important to point out that there are other reasons that you might have low numbers of amphibians. So, one of the first things when I walk up to a pond, a farm pond that I'm looking at, one of the first things I look at is, are there frogs scattering everywhere around the bank? Because if there are, I can almost instantly tell you that there aren't a lot of largemouth bass in that pond, right? Because if there were a lot of largemouth bass, they'd be eating the tadpoles and they'd be gobbling up those frogs. And so predators are one of the big reasons that we don't see a lot of amphibians around a pond. So just because you don't have them doesn't mean you have poor water quality, but amphibians are really susceptible to declines in water quality. And so things like eutrophication, so adding a bunch of nutrients to a waterway can cause problems. Pesticides, herbicides, certain chemicals that we apply have been shown to impact these amphibian populations. And it's sometimes it's a direct effect. Sometimes it's the chemical that we're adding or the surfactant that we're adding. Other times it's things like, hey, we have so many nutrients in this pond that we're giving off a lot of oxygen during the day and we're using up a lot of oxygen at night. And so our oxygen levels are plummeting to the point that a tadpole can't survive in this little pond that we have, right? And so balancing, kind of the water quality side of things and understanding that there's direct and indirect effects on these critters, I think is really important. But we start to see these declines related to water quality a lot of times, and it's just kind of the first indicator that, hey, maybe something's going on.
Sure. If you're killing all your tadpoles, then next thing may be a fish kill or something like that.
Yeah. Definitely. And a lot of times you'll see tadpoles can outsurvive fish. And so you might have a fish kill, it might be an indication that, hey, maybe there's something that got into that water that we don't want our livestock to be consuming, right? And so if you start to just, pay attention, and if you start to see that you're not hearing frogs or you're not seeing frogs when you walk up, it might just be wise to call someone or look into it a little more.
Sure. So what other things might lead to population declines besides just what's happening at and right around my pond?
Worldwide, amphibians have been declining since the 80s. And so it's been a pretty consistent decline for the last 40 or 50 years. And so lots of reasons that we think that's happening. A lot of it's habitat use changes. And so if you think about, where a lot of our listeners are ranchers or farmers, and the operations that we have, how that's been handled over the last 40 or 50 years has changed a lot, right? And so, if you think about the typical farm, there used to be a lot of lowland areas or creeks, and again, it doesn't have to be a traditional pond to benefit these amphibians. It can be a low area that collects water and is moist for months at a time or weeks at a time even, right? And so a lot of habitat changes. We've lost some of the ephemeral wetlands that we've had. We've lost some prairie potholes that we have. So a lot of declines in habitat use is probably the biggest reason. Some other things, pesticides. And so we've started to apply different chemicals to our air landscapes. And when those wash into waterways, that can cause issues. There's been studies that have shown tadpole mortality. They're really susceptible to a lot of different chemicals. Malformities in adults. We've talked previously about, the fluke, the flatworm that can get into adult frogs and have them have extra appendages. And they think that is tied into, hey, they have extra appendages. They're not going to move as easily. And then they can get picked up by a predator, and that helps that parasite complete its life cycle. But you can see animals that are stressed out in an environment that has contaminants. That stress makes it harder to fight off parasites, so you get some secondary effects like that. There can be changes in habitat that the eggs need. So if you think about an egg being laid, most eggs are laid in these aquatic environments. But then once those tadpoles hatch, they need to have areas where they can, one, get away and be safe, but two, also, move around enough that they can complete their life cycle. So if you don't have enough vegetation or too much vegetation, that can cause issues as well. Drought, rainfall are issues. There's disease implications. So there's a lot of different reasons that these populations are declining, but those are a lot of the key ones there for sure.
So, you've mentioned a whole lot of different things that are related to these declines that we're seeing in amphibians. Why should we care about them? Besides just hellbenders and tadpoles and mudpuppies and all these things are cool, why should we care?
Well, I think, there's a lot of value in just being cool. I think for me personally, being able to sit outside and listen to a frog or go catch a tree frog, man, there's not many things that are more exciting, especially when you're 10 years old or something, than going out and finding a gray tree frog or green tree frog or something. That's just, to me, that's really exciting if you like to be outside. But, from a practical standpoint, the water quality issue, I think, is really important. And so understanding, tracking these populations, and that's what these biologists are out doing a lot now. Tracking the populations can help us kind of understand water quality trends, right? So what's going on the landscape scale? How are some of the implications of what we're doing on a landscape scale affecting the water quality, and then the trickle effect. So how's that affecting, the fish if you're a fisherman, or the livestock if they're drinking out of your pond, or, we've talked about blue-green algae concerns. So that can all be part of it too. So I think understanding the critters are cool. Selfishly, that's part of why I want to talk about it. I think they're neat, but also understanding that from an aquatic standpoint, they're really good indicators of kind of what's going on. They're the first domino to fall to say, hey, we need to get our act together. We're going to lose this habitat a lot of times.
Yeah, so instead of the canary in the coal mine, you got the cricket frog in the pond or something.
There you go. Yeah. New phrase right here.
Yeah. So, are there any invasive species that are causing declines for the amphibians, or on the flip side of that, do we have any amphibians that are also invasive species?
Yeah, both of those are true. So, when we think about invasives, that could be something like a largemouth bass in a pond where it's not native to, right? And so if we keep them contained, that's okay. But on that local, that micro habitat level where we're talking about one farm pond, those bass are going to gobble up those tadpoles and frogs. And so that's definitely part of it. Unintended consequences of stocking. So out west, we've seen populations decline. A lot of different amphibians out in the western United States have plummeted to the point that they're either extirpated or very close to it. A lot of that's because we're stocking trout out there, right? And so the fishing opportunity, how does that tie in? It's not something that necessarily we were thinking of when we put those fish in. But sometimes those unintended consequences. Bullfrogs are native to our area, but their range is expanding as well. And bullfrogs are ferocious eaters. They'll go out, they'll eat just about anything. They'll eat little birds, they'll eat mice, they'll eat other frogs. They'll just eat anything that goes by them, and they can get really big. The other thing that happens is the tadpoles for bullfrogs are really big too, and they will gobble up everything. And if they're in a happy environment, they can stay a tadpole for a year or two, a really, really long time, a lot longer than most people think. And so they have no reason to become a frog if they're getting all the food and all the oxygen, and they're happy in their environment. They don't have to worry about it drying up and switching to a terrestrial environment. So those types of things. Cane toads are kind of fun to talk about. They're really big frogs.
Yeah.
Right?
How big?
Well, that's, I don't know how big, a couple pounds or something. Or,
wow.
They're really big. I mean, they make a bullfrog look little, right? So they get to be really big. They're poisonous if they're ingested. So they make animals, they act loopy, really, really drunk, and then it can kill them too. So not fun to be around, but they'll eat anything that comes by them. They were introduced to Florida, and they've just started kind of taking off and causing some issues. So, we have non-native species that are definitely causing some problems with these amphibians as a whole.
Sure. So one of the things you mentioned was stocking trout in water bodies in the West, and I thought there was supposed to be trout in those water bodies. So where are we stocking trout that they're causing problems?
Well, there's a couple of things that go along with that. So there are supposed to be trout in a lot of these water bodies, but if you think about the trout that naturally occur, I don't know how much fly fishing you've done, but a lot of these waterways have small trout in them, and the trout, they don't get as big as they do if we stock them, or their life cycles, are different than the fish that we're stocking. So I think a lot of times the trout might be supposed to be there, but they're supposed to be there in different ways than what we're putting them out there for. And so understanding that's just, that's a very good question, because they're already there. What's the harm in putting other ones in there? But there's a big difference between, a 6-inch trout and a 2-pound trout that we're putting out there. And the other thing is densities. And so, people want to go fly fishing. They want to catch a bunch of trout, and there's entire ecosystems, economic ecosystems surrounding that. And so figuring out how many trout, and, you want these people to be successful in their fishing. So I think that's a lot of the changes. We have expanded the range in some areas. We've stocked some rivers where, maybe the trout have been extirpated for a while, and now we've added them in. But I think more it's the change of the type of trout that are out there than necessarily they've been there or they haven't been there.
Sure. Another example that some students have brought into my human wildlife conflicts class is some of those really high altitude lakes aren't supposed to, or high elevation lakes didn't naturally have trout in them, and they were dumped in by helicopter or whatever, and in those situations have caused some problems for frogs too.
That's a really good example. I mean, that is a key example. Those really high elevations, right? They shouldn't have them up there, and there's value too to being able to go fish some of those ponds. So figuring out, it's not that one is more important than the other, right? We need to have kind of an adaptive management approach where we look at from a lot of different perspectives. I think perspective is key in a lot of this.
Sure.
If you're just worried about the frogs, you'd say, why the heck would you put in those fish? If you're just worried about fishing, you'd say, why the heck do we care about the frogs? It's probably important that we get together and discuss all the different perspectives, try to come to an agreement on how to best manage.
Sure. And that mindset's also probably really important when we're thinking about land use change and how that impacts critters too, because, sometimes we talk about, well, the changes in farming have led to this. A lot of times I think that feels like we're pointing fingers at people.
Sure.
Right. And a lot of times, we're studying things to understand why that they've happened, not to point fingers, but so that we can figure out how to make everything work together.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's very true. It can come across as, hey, you're attacking me, right? And that's just maybe how it's delivered. I think a lot of times we're saying, hey, this is a cause. How can we still get to the same outcome, but maybe avert that detrimental effect there? So maybe that's a good episode for another day. I could talk about that for the next 20 minutes. But
Yeah. So what are some of the other things that we haven't talked about yet that might be causing decline?
Well, rainfall's a big one, and so we still have rainfall events similar to what we've had in the past, but the extremes are becoming more common. And so just thinking about Kansas the last 5 years or so. A couple years ago, I was getting calls from everyone saying, hey, I don't have any water in my pond. What can I do? And that went on. And this year I got a bunch of calls saying, I have too much water in my pond. What can I do? And so, we're not getting that kind of median value much anymore. The average, we're getting extremes. We're getting really dry years and we're getting really wet years. And so it's kind of this boom or bust, feast or famine kind of environment, and understanding that a bad drought year can set back populations for years to come, right? And so, and maybe that's needed. Maybe we need a reset because, bullfrogs or something have taken over. So that's really common. Drought can also be really good. We talked briefly about ephemeral pools, right, or vernal ponds. So these areas that fill up with water and then dry out completely. It's really important for amphibians that we have that dry spell, because the amphibians, have switched from aquatic to terrestrial, and by drying out, we can make sure we kill the fish that were in that pond. And so we're getting rid of the predators, and then next year the amphibians can come back and use that habitat again without worrying about being eaten. And so drying out can be a good thing if we're looking at it from that perspective. If you want to just have fish in your pond, it's not a good thing. But from the ecology standpoint, there might be benefits. So I think that the extremes of the weather are important. Not necessarily much we can do about that, but understanding the effects is something that we could do.
Sure. I had a professor when I was an undergraduate student who made the argument that there were many, many more acres of ephemeral wetland in Kansas now than there were historically because of all the road ditches that we've added.
Sure.
But I think he just did that to be argumentative. Of course, a road ditch behaves very differently than maybe a buffalo wallow or something like that would. Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that, but my hunch is that they are not the same thing, right? There might be some value, but if that's all you have, I would guess that the amphibians would go there. But I'm guessing they would prefer a buffalo wallow over a road ditch and all the runoff that comes with that.
Yeah. So what can we do about this stuff? How do we try and make sure that we can still do all the things we need to do, but also still have some amphibians around?
Yeah, there are a lot of groups out there that are doing active things about it, and so groups like Ducks Unlimited, and so they're out there. A lot of times they're managing wetlands, for ducks, but they also do a lot of good work, beyond just that focus of the ducks. Right? They're a conservation group. They care about the environment a lot of times, and so they're going out. They're managing a lot of different wetlands, for example. The NRCS is doing a lot of good work with wetland restoration, and so making sure we have these environments that are going to be wet and then dry out as well. So lots of great groups out there doing things. If you want to start to do things in your land or your backyard, or contribute to a group if you're in an urban setting, you can do things like go establish riparian buffers. We've talked about letting vegetation grow up, not just around a pond or around a creek, but throughout the watershed where all that water's flowing in. That can all be really beneficial. Some of those low spots, maybe just think about your perspective. If you're out managing lands and you have an area that gets wet every year, instead of being grumpy about that, are there ways to, can you plant some pollinators there, which have been shown to help increase yield? So maybe you can make up for some of the loss of the wet areas by doing some management around there. Maybe you can just think about the perspective. Hey, instead of the loss of the growth that you have there, think about it as an addition of, some other critters that you get on your property or something. So, there are a lot of easement programs out there that can help provide some financial assistance to take some of those lowland wet areas and help you establish some more permanent cover that could benefit a lot of these critters. So lots of different things we can do, but those are just a few of them.
Yeah, well, that makes sense to me.
I think getting out, I say this every time, I think just getting out and enjoying your pond or enjoying the aquatic habitat you have out there is really important. So you just see so much and you ask questions, and I think it really helps you enjoy the environment when you get out and enjoy what you have.
Awesome, Joe. Well, this has been a great topic. I know next time I hear some frogs calling or see a salamander somewhere, I'll have a lot more to think about. So thanks for bringing it to us. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll be back to you here in a couple of weeks with a terrestrial episode.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.